How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Eulier Gonzalez here. So, in today's video, I want to make a quick recap of how do I get here for this model known as data fetching. As a way to now understand is how do I get here first, and how does it make sense when building React applications for fetching data, not only for our local host, right, but also for data that live in servers, so somewhere on the internet, right? So the TLDR there of this React course, which is taught by Josh Comeva, is to first understand is where are we, where do we come, or how do we get here by looking at the problem that React has back in 2011 when they have now several user interfaces, and each one of them, particularly the message icons and the chat application, as well as the or the messenger drawer and the chat app, right? Each one of those UIs share a specific piece of information that is relevant for the chat and the notifications. But it turns out that because of that, each one of them needs to maintain their own state, and you as a developers or the bunch of developers need to somehow is maintain that consistency, right? So it turns out that it's quite messy to do so, because first you will need to somehow is to keep track of each one of those states, and then update it appropriately. So anytime that you need to add or remove or enhance a particularly information in those states, or that is shared across different UIs, so you need to also update that in all of those different user interfaces. So because they're using is now the model view controller to actually create this kind of application, which is something that we inherit as a industry of how do we make sense to build this kind of applications, this client and server side, right? And the R&D back then, they say, hey, we have now this particular tool that instead of us manually have to keep track these states, so we're going to have this one single source of truth, and then any user interface that have access to that state, when that state change, they will propagate those changes among all of the UI that make use of them, right? So this is the idea behind or React, right? So now React is keep track of this piece of information, and whoever components or UI needs to or use that, well, it would get that data. It would get a fresh state of that data, right? So that's the premise of React. And then I look at the little nuances of how can we use now React here. So for example, by creating our own React, what this React is all about, how can we use React, what happened when we start using React for creating or describing these user elements, using the create element, what this functions returns when we call that, which is just a JSON, a description of the UI at that moment, aka a snapshot of the UI. All right, and now look at the nuances of using React. So for example, that we need to use JSX, which is much more convenient than writing all of this function call and defining this UI primitive. In our case, the web primitive, but it can be also defined, or can be also used to define is mobile native or even WebLG. So, but in any case, so here's the deal. Oh my God. Ooh. Sorry. Mm. Mm. Okay, but here's the deal. Yeah, I feel like an inflammation here. In any case, here's the deal: is that hmm, anyway? Uh, so by using this GSX as a way to now describe is this markdown much more easy, and combine that with the logic, and also use now CSS models to actually kind of or to uh, improve the look and feel of all of these user interfaces, right? So I also look at, well, what are the most common thing that we can do with our GSX. So what is GSX? How does it compare with the traditional HTML and with other templated languages, as well as the basic stuff that we do anytime that we create this kind of user interface. So for example, rendering a list of elements, how useful is for us to use now a particular component from React called fragment, so we can avoid polluting is the DOM with all of this padding component that needs to contain all of the children. All right. How is important for us to define is the ID of all of this list of elements, because React behind the scenes doesn't automatically keep track that for us, and that when you need to render conditional elements, how can we do that, and what are the ways to do that using just JavaScript, right? Whether it's using the if statements or the and operator or ternary operators, and some of the nuances here, especially with the type. And after that, see how also can we add now CSS to our components via CSS model. And this is just to wrap up this basic model. And then when it comes to now provide interactivity to the users, so understand now how the things was done before React and is still done only with HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript. So whether it's you pass a function handler to that event listener, or you just call the function in that event or at the HTML tag, right? So why this is important? Because now in React, this is something that we are not explicitly telling what to do. It's up to React to trigger that for us. This is what we pass now a function as a reference. And there is an interesting things here that's going on, and a particular concepts that is the when a framework or a library is calling your functions for you, this is known as the inversion of control, aka we are now delegating this control to somebody else, in this case the framework, that when the moment is right is going to call that function for us. And that it means that, for example, when we want to provide now some kind of interactivity to the users, right, or aka we want to remember some piece of information over time, with plain JavaScript we use now closures, but with in React we use now specific hooks that React provide us, such as the useState or the core loop. So anytime that you now pass some information to or to any type to this state, right, React behind the scene is going to remember that piece of information for you over time. And anytime that you want to update that state via an event handler, right? So React is going to now detect. So React is going to pass in two scenarios. First is when the page is loaded, And what it does is to recreate the entire DOM structure by calling the append child, and now attach all of those DOM nodes into the DOM, right? So you can see as a user the user interface. Uh, and when the component is already mounted, so the React is going to detect which component triggers that state update and automatically update that by first passing to these scenarios. So first, which was the component that triggers that state update? And then I'm gonna call that, aka known as the rendering phase, which I'm going to spot the difference here. I'm gonna call that component, and if that component contains more React elements, I'm gonna continuously call that until there is no more components, aka now React have this new version, or this is new snapshot of the UI that contains this latest state of the UI. And spotting the difference during the rendering phase by saying, hey, which one from these two snapshots, what are the things that change? And then on the commit phase, it's going to apply only the bare minimum necessary changes to the DOM. And now the browser detects those DOM changes and refresh the UI to match that, right? So this is the core loop, as Josh Kameva mentioned, or I would like to also go with that. So the TLDR is that this particularly loop allow us is to now provide this interactivity in our applications, that anytime that we need to remember some piece of information, and this is useful, for example, to show now counters, or to store a piece of information over time, we need to update that, right? These hooks allow us to do so. And also, anytime that you update your state in an event handlers, this is something that is asynchronous, aka it's going to happen is on the next tick. And if you find yourself needing to update several of these states in the same handlers, you can do that, and it will be counted as one, aka it's going to batch that into single one, and then it's going to run all of those state updates in the render or in the core loop, right? So I mentioned all of this because part of the idea of understanding these core features of React, that is how you can remember piece of information, and when you need to, for example, now create now form, which is most of the time the thing that we need to do as front-end developers, right? How can we do that, and what are the things that are useful for us to do so? So forms, because this different user interface that we have in our the web platform, right? So whether it's the type, and here you might have is password or email or text, all right? All of them behave quite similarly. And also we have the another common one, like the select, or the radio buttons and checks buttons, also the range. And I will hit the brake a little bit with the checkboxes and radio buttons, because this is something that a lot of the time we have to do as part of the SaaS that you're building, or any SaaS that, like, that particular company that you're working on is building to offer that. And it turns out that especially with the checkboxes and radio buttons, or any other inputs, so the idea here is that you need to attach that state that you define in your React component into that, and therefore now you need to react or detect when a change happened. This flow of setting the value in an input and then retrieve that value when something changed is known as this data binding on the input, right? So this data binding, which is something fairly simple with inputs, type text and password and password, emails, and text, it is fairly easy to do that. The same for range, all right? But when it comes to other type of UI like selects, which is also part of the primitive, and radio buttons and checkboxes, so all of them follow this particular pattern except for the radio and checkboxes because they behave quite different to other UI inputs. So in this radio and checkboxes, the idea is to, well, define is the label as a field set, all right? So not only define the label, but also define is the type of input, whether it is checkboxes or radio buttons. And on the name is when you define is this group of radio buttons. And on the ID, you match that with the HTML form attribute from the label, right? To actually select that. So when you now are on so you have a radio button and a label. So when you click on the label, it will select that. So this is part of the inner behavior of these radio buttons and check boxes. And what happened is that when you have this kind of things in React, right? Especially if you want to select multiple of them or to create several of them, we can do that here. And there is a particular example here that I know that this is quite go beyond the scope of today's video, but I do find that it's very, very relevant. All right. So for examples like this, all right, as a way to test now your understanding of these radio buttons and checkboxes, because these inputs, whether it's radio or not, if you put them with the same name, you're saying, hey, I'm grouping these inputs, right? And if I want to select that, right, to achieve this behavior, which is something that here is not working, that's interesting. Oh, it means that the label here, exactly, there is no label. That's what happened. That's why we didn't have this behavior. That's fine. So what I can say is label, right? HTML form, provide an ID, and let's say this will be is agree no. All right. This will be now is the content here, and when I click on no, now it worked as expected. This is part of the inner behavior as it is. So what happens if you want to actually select here each one of this? Well, it's going to be based on the value that it has or that value that it holds. So for this example, it's pretty straightforward. It's yes or no. So anytime that it change, I want to now set this value to that, and the check property get that value and assign to this particular value that we have for, right? This is something fairly easy to do, all right? And anytime that you need to generate is that random or these selections here, as you can see here, right? Anytime that you need to select this huge selection, I can also is restore this to actually go over here. So anytime that you have to select this kind of things, and this is something that we're gonna see a lot of the time. Here I have an object, all right, where it contains all of these different countries, and I do want to render that. So what I can say is to say, hey, let me now define is this country here, define a form define a field set that is this rectangle that happened here. Hey, this is the field set. Shipping info with the legend, the label with now country. This is now part of the select here, all right? And it's inside of here that I'm going to define is all of these options. Because now I need to do some data treatment here to say, hey, what'll be our countries to render, okay? So I need to pull them up. So by doing is this, get me only the values here, right? What I can do is this. Whether if I say, hey, give me is the entries of this object, of these countries, all right? Give me this value and assign this into an array here. So now when I have the countries here, I will see now all of these countries as a map, all right, as an array, and then I can now iterate through each one of them. But since this country is now an array of two elements, you're gonna have is now the name. It's gonna have is the key and the value here. So since this country we're gonna have is the key and the value, I can say is, hey, give me is the key and the value, all right? And now I do want is to render this as an option. So let me put it here. Let me render this as an option here. Okay. Yeah, you're right. And then you got it. So now this is countries. All right. Tiki. So I say is this country. Yeah, this object entries, we're trying to transform is this into that. So if I console log here this, and then I try to get rid of this for a moment, all right, I do have is this, right? But this might not what I needed, okay? Or I can just work with that as well. So if I'm going to work with that, right? I say, well, the country, all right? I do want is to now here on the countries, iterate this. This one, all right? And do something like this. So I know that the country at the first position will be is the value or the key, and the other is the value here, right? So now that I know this, whether if I say this, give me the key and the value, and then I say this is the key, right? And the value. This is how can I structure this kind of piece of information. So now I'm rendering is all of this as it is, all right, where I can show something like this. And here, I can do this and say, hey, so on change here, I do want is to now update the proper value here. To say set country to the key to the value. All right. So I do want to have that value. And I do want to use is now an inline function here, right? This is when on change, all right? and now the value here of this will be now is the key here, right? Because I'm rendering is a collection of elements, I can now wrap this into a fragment, or I can just pass this now this an ID, and for demo purposes I can say, hey, let's gonna use this the key because it has some unique identifiers as it is. So when I select here, right, okay, it's not working, no problem. It's not working because it's not working because this is the set countries, set country. This is the value. I am setting that. So when on change, I do want to set that, right? And it's supposed to render is here on country. Okay. Oh, it's because it's not here. It's because it's here. It's on the select here. Yeah, it's on the select. That's right. It's on the select. Exactly. Either target or value, but it's getting is the value, right? So this might be one case to do this, all right? So by setting and reading about that change here, because here is on the option, it doesn't detect that, but it's on here that is going to detect that, right? So because here now the key that we're using is this and the value is here, right? This is one way to do this. It's gonna show you that as expected, right? Or we can just go into the another one, the previous one. No. What? Yeah, the ID and the key. Yeah, because it's something like this. So if I leave things like this, right? Let me do this pretty quickly. The key and the value, and I'm going to show you is the value. It turns out that if I do this, right? Yeah, it turns out that if I do that, it turns out that if I do that, and if I select here on the Mm-hmm. And then I select that. Okay, so and then I select that, right? So not only that I select, but I can say, hey, let me now set this value here to be whatever you have initially, which is, for example, the country, right? As it is. And now this actually worked as expected. Why this is useful to kind of recap here? Because again, here I'm looking is at this particular pattern, and when we're using is this UI in the select, which is something that is a lot of the time useful to recreate our own. Most of them say, no, we don't need to recreate that kind of stuff. But in fact, we do. you know, in fact, we do. So after that, and then I explore is now what the problem states and how the things are being passed down to your components, how you can make use of them, and when you need to define some more complex states in or some complex data type in your states, how useful for us is to say, hey, this is how we do the things, all right? And how useful for us is to always return is a new state of that piece of information, especially as an object, right? And this go beyond of today's video, but it also is to look at how you can dynamically generate keys in your components, right? Whether these keys are is using mat.random or crypto.getRandom UUID, the idea here is that if you need to render a huge amount of collections, well, a lot of the time, this is not only how you can do that first, but also is how you can dynamically create them. And as we look at this core loop and the specific inputs that we need to, or the specific use cases like forms, exploring is the several UI inputs to create your forms, to collect user data, whether it is input type text or password or type text input, Jesus, text, password, or email, or even select or content area or radio or checkboxes. And I'm just mentioning is the most common one, and how to use now React to go with it and to make this data binding. All right. And also how you can create is now complex states, how you can represent those complex states, some use case to do that. What are the props and the state? What are the difference between the props and the states? And how you can dynamically create this list of elements to uniquely identify or to be uniquely identifiable by React, right? And when it comes to the state and where the state live, it is important across your application because that will trigger now re-render, something that we're gonna see in today's video, which is the focus on that, right? The memoization and data fetching and memoization. So because when we talk about lifting state up, it means that at that point is where our application is gonna be render, it's gonna be called and create this new snapshot of the UI, and then spot the difference to apply only the bare minimum necessary changes to the DOM. Now, well, the browser will detect those DOM changes and match the UI for us. So this is great. And also a couple things to understand before going into this. One of them is the components instance. Why this is important? Because anytime that you define now an state is attached to this components instance. And these components instances are created, or they are created when React calls them. And that is at runtime. So anytime that now these components are called, whether it's because a state change, now it will recreate is a new state of that component. So this is now part of the difference here between one thing and another, especially in the components instance. And as we look now at this state and with the different state and the problem that the state solve, which is how you can now is update piece of information over time to remember that. So now they come up with a different set of problems, like, hey, how do we now make sure that our applications state is easy to manage, right? And not only that, so depend on the kind of application that you're building, whether it's a SaaS or whether it's a landing page or a blog post or a or a, let's say a game or a heavy client interaction applications or a server-side application or a back office, depend of those use cases, you're now dealing with a specific set of problems. So for example, in the case of building now this blog or landing page, most of the time you just only hold this piece of information at the component level, right? But if you're starting to now building applications that are huge, for example, in the airline industry or the real estate or some market statistic tools, yada yada, just to mention a couple of them. So sometimes now those applications now live on the state, now live on the server side. But if you're building, for example, is a client-side applications, heavy client-side applications like some games and stuff like that, well, you do find yourself in the need to build them, right? And have a new set of problem, which is how do you manage your state and how do you make your state management consistent across your app and easy to debug and all that kind of stuff. So this is what the Redux comes here and say, hey, you know what? This is a particular tool that this is why we are leveraging is the functional programming, because a lot of the time when you find yourself in the need to recompute something or to compute something, it is great for doing complex stuff, but it is not great for doing basic stuff. You know. So and the other is the when the state of the application live, for example, in a database or in someone else's computers, right? So in those cases, now this is our backend application, back office apps. So now the problems is quite different, because here, at least in React, you are not only dealing is with the state, all right, but also you're dealing is with other type of problems. So for example, is how do I make sure that this component get the right data at the right time? How can I avoid hammering the API anytime somebody get into this component? How can I catch the response? So I can avoid hitting the or hammering the API. And how can I make sure, or how can I predict a network request? So even I can abort that as well. And also, how can we deal with paginations? And all of these kind of problems are network related problems, which is the focus in today's video. All right. So this kind of problems, all right, this set of problems, which are now when the state are mostly on the server, all right, is something that as I'm going to explore then, right? And the other is how we can make sure that the data doesn't grow stale by revalidating. Remember, we have our state of info, we have the state of the application here. So this is the couple question here, that how do I make sure that I fetch the right data at the right time? Just to make a quick recap here quickly. How do I make sure that the state that I have here doesn't grow stale? So I need to somehow revalidate it. And how can I catch the response so I have is the fresh state and I avoid hammering the API? And how can I predict is this network request? And if I need to abort that, how can I do that, right? Or how will it resolve? And how can I paginate this piece of information? So again, all of these different kind of problems are addressing by libraries called like Apollo, which is something that I'm going to use. The other is the React Query and SWR, right? And we'll learn more about them in the Model 3, which is the focus on today's video. Why am I hidden here, right? So in this mental model, I use when figuring out which tool to use. It is a static website like my blog. I reuse Alone. It is a client-heavy application like Beat Saber level editor. I use Redux. It is a server-heavy application like this core platform. I use React plus something to help me with the network stuff. I'm using Versal here, SWR, on this core platform, and I have no complaints. This is the formula I have found work best after years of experience and dozens of projects, but a lot of this really does come down to subject preference. So, but in any case, once I look at that, right, and then explore, let me go back here, and then explore now is how can I create a particular game with that, the Worldly game, which is it was quite interesting, by the way. How now we organize project here using those basic building blocks. So with component, because everything that we have before React 18 was components, and we layer out all of the logic or user interface in the components, this actually cluster the entire DOM tree or the React tree for things that somehow we don't need to put that at the UI level, because this is the only tool that we have back then, and sometimes you need is to add some logic, some business logic to that. So this is where now the React team say, hey, let's going to use now for that hooks. So hooks here are now these little nice bundles, particularly custom hooks, that we can add some piece of logics and reuse across our API or our app. So the most common hooks here are, for example, is the use ID, which is, again, each one of those hooks are great for specific problems that React team has and that we might have. So for example, is with the ID, it's a, okay, now that I have this piece of information, let me have a huge table with a global state that anytime that you need to create a new ID, well, I can give you that for you. This is useful for HTML form when you have now labels and an input and you want to uniquely identify those across your application, right? So this is something that sometimes is useful to have a global uniquely identifier, despite that components on the web or the web industry is more prone to go to all of this reusability. Sometimes you need to define this long running this long running tables, these global identifiers. Another hooks, right? And before going into other hooks, this specific hooks follow a certain rules. First, they must be using a React component, except for custom hooks, which is something we're going to see that in today's video. And the other is that those components must be at the top of your component. So do not put it in any looping syntax or if statements or none of that, right? The explanation go beyond of today's video. It's quite interesting to understand because it will give you now a sense of what is the software engineering problems related to, and that is organizing data and using and doing that in a sequence manner, or using that so organize all of this piece of information using some data structures, whether it is as a sequence or whether it is as a linked list or a double linked list or a tree-like structure or a hash, right? So that's actually what is the valuable stuff as a software engineering here, right? That you are capable to use all of these tools that people before us actually dedicate time and energy, sweats, and perhaps blood to just come out and say, hey, this particular way of organizing things are very efficient, are very effective. So in other words, if you have now a huge stack of let's say you are now the owner of a fruit shop, right? And you have these huge stacks of, more simple, to put it simple, you are the owner of this, I don't know how you say that in English. Hardware store. Yeah, hardware store. So let's say you are now the owner of a hardware store, and well, you have all of these different screwdrivers and things like that, things and the like. So you need to find some way to not only find that pretty quickly, but also find the right one for the client. This is what the software engineer at the end of the day is all about. And when I understood that, it was for me way much more easy to do so. And I understand why a lot of people, I definitely now get it why people actually are asking this kind of question. Hey, can you build now a linked list? Can you build now a stack or a queue? Can you build me is now a tree, or can you now is tell the machines to build a binary search? Okay, silly things, but at the end of the day, is all about is how your mind works when it comes to organize things and when it comes to search for things, sorting and searching. Sorting, searching, and organize are one of the useful things that I can get from the software engineering, and something that I am applying that to my own life. So in any case, that go beyond the scope of today's video, but that's the whole idea of this rule of hooks, right? So I also look at this immutability revisited to understand now that anytime that you update the new state of your application, or you update and state, what React is doing behind the scenes as a very crude or as a very crude draft, is that now is reserving spacing memory for that, and anytime you update that, it's gonna allocate spacing memory in a different space in your RAM, and it's gonna do that, so on and so forth and so on. You might wonder is who is gonna clean up that mess, you know? Well, it is also part of the React to indicate that when you don't have any reference to that object, to that spacing memory, now it's up to the garbage collector, the JavaScript PAL to say, hey, if you find yourself this space in memory that doesn't have any reference, so now it is a candidate to be garbage collected. Make it available for other part of our application, right? So this idea of this immutability and understanding that and why we actually now regenerate is a new object here, or anytime that you state or you update the state of an object here, you return is a new object. It is also it is also important because as we explore all the different type of hooks, it makes sense why we have this. Don't worry if you don't get that. It took me quite a while to kind of understand and wrap my mind around this. But the other hook is the ref. And this, what it does is to allow us now some piece of information, right? That won't be that it won't be altered or modified, or it won't be affected by the user state. And if anytime that you want to store some piece of information here, whether it is any JavaScript types, but usually is DOM elements, that you can now hold that, right? And then do something with that. This is useful for getting is the input, or getting is the canvas, or getting is the audio or video, and then now interact with that element when you or when the user now interact with it, or when you detect an event on that line. So that's great. That's great, right? Or the use ref, all right? And I also see a couple examples of that. Very, very interesting example, I must admit, right? Exactly, it doesn't work this. And with that, then I look now at the side effects, which is another hooks. So anytime that you need to somehow run is a function here after every renders, this is what we can do. So sometimes you need to synchronize it to a server, or you need to sometimes you need to fetch data from a server, or you need to read or write locally a database or your local storage, or perhaps to interact with the timers interact with the timers, or interact with the event, or detect or subscribing to global events. So this is our thing that you can do in your normal HTML, CSS, and JavaScript applications, right? But here in React, it has a particular way to do so. All right. So anytime again that you need to somehow is to kick off a script after your render that needs to do any of this common task, whether it is to fetch data from a server, or to read and write a local storage, or to interact with a timer, or to listen for global events. So now side effects, or these effects, are the way to do that. So this is a custom hook that React give us to, and say, hey, the anatomy of this is that you're gonna pass me now a function here, all right? And this is what it's going to run always if you don't pass me. So here's the anatomy. I'm gonna receive is a callback function as the first parameter, and the second parameter is an array of dependency. If you don't provide me any of those arrays or of those depths, I'm gonna run this script after every render, okay? But if you provide now an empty array, that indicates that I'm going to run this script only once, when the component is mounted, all right? But if you pass now an array of dependency, I'm gonna run this script anytime that those dependency changes, right? And this is quite interesting of talking about dependency changes, because for primitive values, so they change when their value change from one to another, all right? So in the case of strings, booleans, symbols, big int, they change when their value change. But the thing here is that how do you now make sure, how do you do that with objects? They change when their reference changed. So when that identifier or this variable that hold now an object, and that object which reference is a piece in memory there, right? So when that identifier now changes its name, so for example is here, right? So let's say I have here now is the user, and then the user one, I held this as it is, right? And this is, despite that they have the same name, let's put it here, say name, right? And then you somehow need to extend that, right? And here I'm going to say, hey, let user one, right? Say name, despite that they have the same value, say Arthur, right? Despite that they have the same name, all right? If I try to compare that with both of them, JavaScript say, no. This comparison of these two objects, they are different. If you, for example, are comparing the same object, which is the same reference, all right, so now it makes sense that they are the same. This is when things get tricky, and again, I don't want to confuse you, which is something that we're gonna now flesh that out more in today's video. But what this side effects is allowing is to run this script after every renders to do this more common stuff. And that makes a ton of sense. A lot of sense. Okay. Yeah, to do this common stuff here. Yep, to do this common stuff. And those common stuff that I look is, well, how can I synchronize, or how can I now change some piece of information? So for example, in the document.title, right? And a couple exercise by looking at how can we use the array of dependencies, how can I now is synchronize or run this script to store this piece of information locally as it is, right? And some of the effect links rules that a lot of people love to get rid of that, you know? And in rare cases, we need to access the freshest versions inside of an effect. But we don't want the effect to rerun whenever a variable changed. And this is not as part of the stale values. And then how these things works on mount. How can I use now with the subscription? So for example is, hey, I want to detect if the mouse move, or to resize, or the intersection observer API. And also part of the anatomy is that this effect not only receives a function, but also its return is a function that is the cleanup function, which says that, hey, once this effect is run, when this component is mounted that has that effect, I'm going to now run these cleanup functions and then the effect as it is, as a way to now make these components to run from a fresh start with your effect. So in other words, as a way to make your UI run in a run in a new state, despite that this UI is doing things that are outside of React. So for example, the things that I mentioned before. So this is why the cleanup function is being used, right? And this cleanup function return is always a function. Why the cleanup function return is now a function? Glad you asked. Well, because this is now the way of how you are telling to React to call this function whenever it sees fits. So this is part of the life cycle of the cleanup function. So on the initial renders, it's going to call the renders and then your effects, right? And when on subsequent renders, it's gonna now is called the cleanup function, and then, or in the subsequent render, it's gonna call the render, the cleanup function, and the effects. And when this component is unmounted, it's gonna call the cleanup function. And of course, it makes a lot of sense to do so. And there now here are some couple special gotchas here. Any time that you need to set, or in some rare cases, you need to get the fresh state of your application, or get the fresh state in your effect without triggering an effect, right? So why am I mentioning this? You might wonder. Well, because sometimes this is some of the things that we want to do so, and because in these corner cases, how do you start a process, or how do you start your script to do these things that go beyond React, or known as the synchronization process? All right, anytime that you do this kind of stuff, whether if you want to run a long running process, all right, in that component, or you want to now is start a process, and anytime that this component is unmounted, or anytime that this component is render, right, you want to now is rerun this effect. So clean up the function and run the effect. And when a render happens, clean up the function and rerun this effect. The idea of this, right, or at least with these two scenarios, is to identify what are the long-running tasks you want to do that in there. The other is to, hey, instead of doing that, right, I do want to have access to the component states, which is quite interesting inside of this effect. So in other words, I do want to have this long-running task, all right, and somehow have access to that piece of information, which is something that we do here in this case, right? Or anytime that you create now an effect, you're going to separate your effect, because this will indicate that, hey, I am running this specific script right after the render, and this script do a specific stuff. So this is why the separation of concern is useful here. So that's quite interesting, right? That's a very powerful stuff here. A very powerful stuff. So this in this example is, hey, I am creating is now this effect. First is just to synchronize with the space keyword, and then do something about it, right? And the other is to say, hey, I want to now run this effect to now is synchronize with the state, or in this case is to synchronize with the audio tag, right? This is what these things actually are useful. I also look at this as strict mode, which is something that comes with React 19, which say, hey, in order to avoid any common gotchas we're using effects, I'm going to now run your components, twice or run your effect twice, right? So in this strict mode, right, what it's doing is to run your effect, the cleanup function, and then your effect. This is only on development mode. And now when I explore now the custom hook, which is why I was finally, I get here, is that this custom hooks allow is to bundle now is specific logic, particularly React logic, right? In to React logic that allow to describe is behavior or app behaviors. That is interesting. That is very, 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 very interesting because this is the idea behind of these custom hooks. It allows you to now bundle up is in a function your React logic to describe is some app level behaviors, all right? And this React logic or your business logic here is useful, for example, for data fetching, all right? And speaking of this data fetching here, right? Speaking of this data fetching here, so for example, here I just abstract is this custom hook. So one of the great things of custom hooks is that any of this stuff that I mentioned, all right, or this is script that you want to run after every render, all right. So for example, is do a data fetching or reading and writing the local storage, or perhaps the creating some intervals here or listen for global events. So you can abstract each one of those into their own custom hooks, which is this bundle, is this JavaScript functions that allow you to define now is behavior, app behaviors using this custom hook or using now React hooks for that. That's the idea behind the custom hooks. So anytime that I look at a custom hook is because, hey, here I'm describing is a app level behavior, all right? So for example, in this case that, this use mouse position is describing is an app level behaviors that we can reuse across our application. And I know there's some other things out there, right? So for example, like this, right? And what it did with this is just using the interceptor observer to go with. But the idea here is with the toggle here, right? Is that, hey, or this custom hooks is that, hey, we can now abstract this piece of this piece of app behaviors into their own files, and we can reuse them across our React application. So that's great. That's quite convenient because when it comes to now is wrapping, or when it comes to run script for fetching data, right? This is when things get now and opens up a new opens up a new world of possibilities here. I'm gonna make a quick pause here. I'll be right back. And we're back. All right. So after that huge overview of the React, right? Finally, with the help of custom hooks and how this nice convenient way of bundle is React logic that describe is app level behaviors. So one of those behaviors that we can or that we need in our UIs, right, is pulling data from external sources, particularly in a web server. So this data fetching model is just about to describe is how we did things, and I would like to make a quick pause here because I do think that this is quite important to understand is that how we do things uh, initially in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then now here, yeah, but I do want to know is more about the, wait, what? About this origin. All right, it's just to ask a question, is that how do we now from the client side we send data to a web server? So because this was a problem because this was a problem back in 2000s, all right, and I would love to know about the JSON origin, especially the date of this. All right, it was in 2005. So Douglas Crockford originally specified the JSON format in the early 2000s. They and Chip Morningstar sent the first JSON message in April 2001. Holy moly. Holy moly. Douglas Crockford at the Yahoo building. So the point of this is that with this standard, or this way of how we can now, is this open standards of how we can now exchange data in a human readable that consists on key value pairs and an array or a serializable values, right? This is a format that is using exclusively for web applications and servers. And JSON is a programming language independent data format, right? It was derived from the JavaScript, but many modern programming language include code to generate and parse JSON format here. Why am I mentioning this? Because in order to send data from the client to the server, right? We do that, what we did this is using now the form. So the form, if you take a look at the HTML form here, like this. So the form UI HTML element, this allows us to, as you can see, element representing a document section containing interactive control for submitting information. So this submission of information, which, let me see if I can describe here, is this the URL that process the form submission, and this can be overridden by form actions, right? So you can now add to your submission form an action, okay? And this action is going to, whether can be overridden by the button or an input type submit or an input image. The encryption type, which is say, hey, what is the MIME type, or the media type, or the content type that I'm gonna send over the cable, right? It's a two-part identifier for a file format and content format. So the purpose is to compatible to file name extensions and uniform type identifier. This file name, yeah, it's compatible. It's comparable. And uniform type identifiers, in that they identify the intended data format, and they are mainly used by technology underpinning the internet, and also used by Linux desktop. So the INA, the IA, the IENAI, the INI, something like that. The INI is the official authority for standardization and publication of these classifications. So the MIME, or the multiple internet mail extension, you can think of this similar as the file name, as the file extensions, right? For denoting type of email message, content, and attachment, hence the original name, multi-purpose internet mail extension. But the point of this MIME type, this multimedia or multi-purpose internet mail extension, right, is just to indicate what is the type of data that we're sending over. The type bar defines the broad use of media types. As November 1996, the registered type were application, audio, image, message, multipart, text, and video. By July 2024, as the web expands, now we have is font, example, model, and haptics. That's interesting. You can also even send haptics and the model. An unofficial top type level is commonly used in chemical, used for chemical formats, and so on and so forth. But the point of this is all of the IR registry, the internet assigned number authority. All right, so this is all the different examples here, right? The question remains, and the question is that what this media type represents. You can think of this like file name extensions. But the idea of this media type, all right, or this MIME type, we say it is safe to say that MIME types is a way for the network layer to know what type of data we are sending over. Close but a small clarification is MIME type don't operate at the network layer specifically. They operate at the application layer. Okay, the network layer doesn't care about the content type. MIME type tells the application, like a browser, email client, a web server, what kind of data is being transferred. Okay, so it is more accurate to say MIME types are a way for applications. Okay, so MIME types are a way for applications, whether it is the clients or the web server, but for any application or even email, to communicate what type of data is being sent, so the receiver side knows how to process this. Interesting. But again, it's at the application level. So this media type, which is the way of how we use now using form before any other data transfer ways, all right, only the form, right? And you say, hey, this is the action, all right, the URL that processed the form submission, the server, and here you have is the enc type or the encryption type. Hey, what is the data that we're going to send over the cable that the application at the other side needs to know and how to decode that? Whether if this is an audio or an image or a multi-part form data, use this if the form contains input elements with type file or text plain or a JSON is another one. This value can be overridden by format type or this and the methods. So what is the method that this form will use to send this data? And that's interesting because this method is an HTTP method to submit the form. They allow methods values are case sensitive, whether it is post, gets, or dialog. That's interesting. When the form is inside of a dialog, close the dialog and cause a submit events to be fired on submit. Let me actually indeed create now as a particular example here. Let's create an interactive example to understand the fundamentals at 2026 about forms, right? Yeah, about forms. How to use form based on this, based on the based on the docs. Let's get into this. In fact, let me stop you here for a brief moment. Let me use the learning and do the research here. Yeah, because I do want to now is understand is the things and how the things fits on this. And I know that this might go beyond of today's or that might go quite a beyond the data fetching, but this is something important to understand how do we get here and to solve a specific use case on sending or transmitting data from a client to a server, to a web server particularly. And well, explore is some of the most common UI primitive in HTML, right? So we got all of it. So we also have now a search, which is another input, as you can see. This is not genetic. That's interesting. Why would I want to wrap this into a search? Search, label, find and filter your query. Label, input type checks is exactly only. But why do we want to have this? It's a container representing the part of the document or an application which form controls or other content related to performing a search or filtering operation. The search elements semantically identify the purpose of the element's contents and as having search or filtering capabilities. The search or filtering functionality can be for the website or application, the current web page or document of the entire internet or subsection therefore. Usage notice, the search element is not for representing search result. Rather, search or filter results should be presenting as part of the main content of the web. That says suggestions and links that are part of the quick search functionality within the search or filtering functionality are appropriately nested with the content of search elements as they are search features. The search elements define a search landmark. This removes the need for adding role search to a form element. Example, header search form. This example demonstrates the use of search as a container for a search within a website. Header to perform site-wide search, and the search is a semantic container for the form that submits the user enter search a query to a server. So this is a semantic here. Web app search. This example demonstrates potential DOM content when dynamically include JavaScript search functionality in a web application. When search functionality is implemented entirely with JavaScript, is no form is submitted, neither a form element nor submitted button is required. For semantics, the search element is included to contain the search and filter capabilities. Find and filter your queries and exact match only. And then you got this here. So you say, hey, for X, right? And here in your section you have is this. The result is this. No, remember that some users don't have JavaScript, and none of your users have JavaScript running until JavaScript is successfully downloaded, parsing and executed. Ensure your user you can access the content of your site with JavaScript disabled. Multiple search like this. You have search title cards, search tile website. Oh, but this is more like for semantic. Ah, this is more like for semantics. Okay, okay. This is more for like semantic. Yeah, this is more for like semantics. Okay. Yeah, but this is more for like semantics. Not found. Run again. Oh, come on, for real? But this is more for like semantics. To say, hey, this form is a search, right? Format, run, share, and clear. And it's going to look for this action. So some server, somebody, is going to process that, right? A search landmark. Landmark. Okay. Okay, but again, the whole point of this is looking at the form, all right, and how you can actually send data using now these actions, right? You specify now the methods, any of the HTTP methods, and when I look at this and say dialog, which is now when a form is inside a dialog, okay, when a form is inside a dialog, when a form is inside a dialog, close the dialog and cause the submit event to be fired and submit in there. This is why I'm actually want to look at this particular example here, you know, because this is the action, the current URL, the API submit, or the search, right? That's interesting that it generates this. The end type, where you can now specify is that, right? Or the application, so on and so forth, or the inputs. This is the generated HTML and submission logs, whether it's a type URL or font or birthday or avatar like this. You can choose your avatar there. Wrap into a legend, right? To say, hey, let me now wrap this into that. The target, the autocomplete, and non-validate. Exactly. Let's add the dialog example from the URL and fix because this is something new here, right? This is something new that you can add now a dialog to that. It's like, what the French those? Right? And dialog is part of that. It's part of an HTML element here. Right? So whether if you do this, and it's going to open now a dialog, you can close it. An invoker command. Or even something like this. You can now escape using the escape to remove that. But again, I define this dialog here and pop over. And the pop over API HTML attributes here. Again, this has become is this UI, this basic UI here. Interesting. So if I open up here and say, hey, let's going to add now here, it's an iframe, it's embedded that. Okay. And if I say here in the body, I want to add now, this is a dialog here. I can also define some dialog again, not an attribute, but I say I can say, hey, I would like to now add this dialog here with a particular identifier. Say dialog test, right? And here I define some buttons there, right? And how you can close, okay, how you can close that, pop over, that's interesting. You say, hey, this is the button, right? And I'm gonna add now here is a paragraph. This is a test. Please close it. And then I can now add the pop over target. Okay. Pop over target. And I need to target is that. And say pop over. And I need to say, hey, dialog test here. And pop over target. Dialog test. Right? Okay, that's interesting. Exactly, and it's gonna target that, and inside of the button it have that particular element. But look at this, using the dialog open attribute. You say now the method here is a dialog. So now the method here is a dialog. Form method dialogs. Form okay button here. Holy moly. Okay. Holy moly. Okay. On the dialog. creating a model dialog here. And show the dialog or close here. I know this might go beyond of the scope of today's video. See, this is it. You can choose this and confirm, get rid of that, right? Because at the end of the day, your reading is that specific element there. Okay. Holy, closing a dialog with a required form input. Closing a dialog with the required form input. Normal close. No validate close. And JavaScript close. And see how you can, okay, so programmatically, as long as you have now that element, get into that. Why this is important? Because at the end of the day, I was just exploring is data fetching. Okay, yeah, I just was exploring is the data fetching here. So this is the way how we can use now methods. This is how traditionally can transfer data from the client and the server. Using is now this specific UI. So the forms allow us to define is now an action. All right. So what is the route on the server that is going to process this data collection? And what are the type of data that we're sending here over the cable that the application level must know, right? So which method are we using to transmit this data over the HTTP protocol, whether it's post, get, and also dialog, all right? And you can send now a get methods here with a body. Request has body, no. The request has a body, does not have a body. You can send a body, but it's up to the server to decide if they're gonna handle that for you. Okay. But from the MDN docs, no, it shouldn't contain a body. Okay. Request using get should only be used to request data and shouldn't contain a body. Okay. You can send data over that. All right. But it's up to the server to process that. By the TLDR, you shouldn't send that data. So, but then again, this is the method that you're going to use. And what you want to do after the display, indicate where to display the response after submitting the form. All right, hey, do I need to load the same browser tab, or do I need to create a new one? All right. And this is part of the things of how you can now traditionally send data that. Let me see if they describe this, accept character encoding. So, but in any case, this is how you can actually communicate or send data before or without JavaScript. Why this is important? Because HTML and CSS was first developed and then now JavaScript was added to the language as part of the Brendan H efforts to bring now interactivity to these kind of applications. And that was back in 1994. And as the move, or as it's progressed, okay, what turns out is that this traditional way of sending data using only HTML, right, that is pretty much like a black box because you don't know for sure what the thing is doing unless you read the spec and see what the thing is actually doing, right? Again, I'm looking right now at the living standard, the HTML living standard. This is also something that we should be more familiar with, right? The forms here. Let me see if they describe the abstract of this. And this is the introduction. This is the forms. And here, so this section is a non-normative. In writing a form user interface, implementing the server-side processing for a form. That's also important, at least to know, but not for this today's video. All right. Configuring a form to communicate with a server, like this. So this is how you can say from the client side, hey, this is now how I'm going to send this data, and this is what you're supposed to handle that route, right? And the picks a name, tiki, all of this kind of stuff, right? And client-side form validations. Here is when we can actually make sense of this, right? That is a very interesting. Enabling client-side automatic filling and form control, whether it's using the autocomplete, right? Or input mode numeric. Improving the user experience on mobile devices. Okay, that's interesting because it's actually telling you how to work with this, you know? And the difference between the field type, autofill field, and the input modality, right? Date, time, and number formats, and how you should treat them, and the categories here. And the form elements, as you can see here, the global attributes, the actions, the URL to use to form submissions, okay? Which is actually part of that. This is the form submission. So when a form is submitted, the data in the form is converted into a structure specified by the enc type, right? And then sent to the destination specified by the action using the given methods, right? So this is what happens anytime that you now submit a form. So it is converted to the specific end type. Hey, application, this is the data that I'm going to transform. This is the data that I'm going to send over the cable. So I'm going to need to convert that into that specific type. This is the destination that is going to handle that, and the method that I'm going to use to send that data or to receive it, right? Form basic, get impose, encoding. So now they change this. So now they change vastly the UI and how now is how the things are generated. You know, validation control and dialog methods. Yeah, that's interesting. And the buttons. Oh, okay. And live playground here. And how you can change that in real time. Even also for dialog. This is also delete this item permanently. This form use method dialog. No HTTP request is made. And it blocks. Okay, no problem. So, but in any case, so this is the fundamentals here, right? And this is how can I actually send data to the, let me, okay. Let's create a basic example with Node.js server in sending a form. Okay. So this is how now, if I look at this element, all right, I'm gonna leave the open standard here. Open that up. Origin of the form HTML element, and by origin I mean is okay. 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 Where did you get this data? Does it say when this was made or the origin of this? Um, so um, mm, mm, mm. Hmm. Mm, mm, mm. So, but in any case, according to them, right, the form elements originated in 1993. Yeah. So this is something that is part of this, of the data fetching. So a bit of history here. So before Fetch API, we have exactly. So before exactly, in the beginning, in the early days of the web, the only way to send data was using the HTML form data, right? The HTML form tag, right? So the HTML form originated in 1993 with the earliest web search engines like a web developed by Martin Kosher, which allows users to submit query via simple input field. Before Fetch API, we have now the XML HTTP request. And why am I mentioned here? XML HTTP request, right? And why am I mentioned that? Because now JSON was created or was implemented in 2001, and it becomes part of the spec in 2006. Holy moly. Holy moly. That's right. Exactly. So the concept behind it was conceived in 2000 by the developers of Microsoft Outlook. The concept was then implemented within the Internet Explorer 5 in browser 1999. However, the original syntax does not use the XML HTTP request identifier. Instead, developers use the identifier of ActiveX objects of this, an ActiveX object from Microsoft. As Internet Explorer 7, all browsers support the XML HTTP request identifier. The XML HTTP request identifier is now de facto standard in all major browsers, including Mozilla Greco's layout engines. Despite this, at the end of 2012, they took over developing and maintaining a living document using the web IDL. And why am I showing you this, right? And cross-domain requests, right? And fetch alternative. Program flow using asynchronous XHR callback can present difficulty with readability and maintenance. So the idea of showing this, especially the XML HTTP request, which was conceived in 2000, all right? Let me put it here this way. Okay, allows a scripted client, usually a program, to transfer data between client and the server. So it was initially, I think I can have that. Yeah, it was initially set as, so it was initially used in 2001, right? And become de facto and becomes de facto and becomes de facto identity and becomes de facto identifier in 2006. All right, in 2006. And then I look at an example of that, right? So because reading asynchronous code is very hard to do, then an alternative comes along with leveraging the promise objects, or in other words, the flow control of the ECMAScript script, which is control abstractions object here. The control abstractions object. The promise object, in other words, the control abstraction objects. So objects that allow to control the flow of execution in our code, right? So that's why, if I put it here, right? So that's why we have, for example, like the iteration, which is allow is to control that execution or to have access to that execution. The same for async and iterators, promise, generators, and async generators as well. So here there is a particular example of doing that. But in this lesson, okay, but in this lesson, we're going to see how to send network requests in the React context by leveraging all of this kind of tools that I have. I know that some people may not go and explain about the XML HTTP requests or even the form, but I do think that it's quite important to understand how do I get here and then understand why, for example, here in React, when doing the data fetching, what are the problems that we are solving or that React applications aims to solve here, right? So for example is search data. All right, most applications exist just to let users interact with the data in a database. So for example, search engines are a huge database and let us filter billions of entries to find most suitable results. Chat applications like Slack that send us and receive its message stored in a database. And social network provide feeds pulled from a database that let us interact with them by updating data in a database. So in the lesson that follow, we'll see how to send network requests in React content. So this is why I look at this. Some of the prerequisites that I actually mentioned here is like, hey, you need to know what is the synchronous and asynchronous, what is a promise, all right? So you need to understand what synchronous and asynchronous code is, and that is the scope, enclosures. Also what a promise is, what promise allows to do, and the other is the HTTP methods and the fetch basics. I didn't make an example here with HTTP basics, but I should do that. Right? Because now this is this convenient API promise base for sending data over the cable. All right, so let's get into this, right? Which is fetching on event. Fetching on event. Fetching on event. And the other is fetching on mount. Fetching on mount. Which is another one, right? Fetching on mount. And a couple exercise, you know. So exercise, right? And async effect gotchas. Async effects gotchas. So let's get into this. So the point of this is that fetching on an event is that when we use a particular pattern, all right, to do so, so for example, like this, here we use this fetch API to send that data using the post method and now parsing that or stringify as a into the body, all right, and then away for that response, which is part of the response, the fetch API, what it returns as a response. So you can now, after that, get the data out of this. But in React application, it is useful for us to go with this 3 or 4 stage, which is idle, loading, success, and error. So there is nothing too fancy about this. Just like, well, if we go back here and do this and say, hey, how can I add this, right? There is no accepting criteria here, just to illustrate that, right? But the thing here is that if I want to represent these different states possible in network states, I need to have is a something called network state, right? And set network state, all right? Where here I'm going to now store this piece of information, and I'm gonna have 4 possible cases. Whether it's idle at the beginning, or error, or sorry, pending, or success, and error. Okay, this is only the 4 possible cases here. I can use now is TypeScript to actually use an enum or a type literal to say, hey, this is only the possible values that I can use, which is great, right? And I'm using useId to actually create, to construct those ideas you can see here, right? And when this being called, if I want to now call that and submit data, so fetching on events or submitting data. So I do have now the endpoint in this silly example. And then as an object, I want to define is the methods here as a post. I also need to define is the body. I can define is some headers here, right? So content accessible area, blah, blah, blah. But in this case, just to make it things simple, the body, I need to transform is this piece of information that I'm going to send over here. And that is, what is the data that I need to send over the cable here? So, because I do want it to send now is the, in this case, the email and the message, right? I need to somehow transform this into a string. AKA, I need to stringify this, right? So now it's going to send that nicely over the cable. I cannot send, so functions is not a serializable stuff. And then, since now I am on an async function, I would like to await for that. No, I would like to await for that and do this. Let me hold this computations in a let me hold these computations into these identifiers, because these identifiers doesn't have the data right away, and because of that, since the server depends on the payload, if this is huge or not, it can stream this data or can send chunks of data, and once that is done, now I can have access to that. So that time of processing that, which is usually fast, right? I need to also is pass control to whoever is going to process that data for me. And since this JSON now is a promise, it's going to be scheduled in the micro task, process that for me, right? And once this is done, now the micro task is going to pass control to this line of code. How do I know that? Because this is what async and await is doing, pretty much like the generators. So the generators, anytime that it see a yield, is going to now pass control to whoever function calls that, right? And then at at some point in the future, at some future part of the code, if that function gets called again, it's going to resume the function execution. That is pretty interesting and also mind-bending stuff to know. But what happened here is this. It say, hey, because this response, let me just briefly describe this. Because this response is something that I don't have right now, because I need to process, especially if this payload is large enough. So I'm going to schedule that task to a specific queue, the micro task queue. And then I'm going to is get that as a JSON, right? So this process will be handled now by a by this micro task queue. And since I want to now is pass control to that, right? I do that using the await, and once you get that, and once that is done, I can now come back, or the JavaScript engine now give me or pass control to this line of code that allow me to actually just store this computation here and finally get the data and hold that as an identifier here, right? I can call this also as a JSON to be more explicit about what this thing is getting into that. But this is it. This is it. You can also wrap this into a try and catch. All right. Why we do this? Because this is how we now is handle. This is how we now handle is or how do we catch errors in synchronous code, right? That's what we use now, the try and catch error, right? And if there is a catch, well, I would like you to only show is the log error here as it is, right? And show me that. So now, having said that, I just only to delegate, I just only to create is the data fetching logic here. So I need to actually make sure that data fetching is being called when I need it. In this case, is on the submit, on the form. So because this form especially is controlled by React, known as control inputs. So here I'm saying, hey, when these things change, sorry. So when these things change, I want to now set is the email. So anytime that the things change, it actually is rendering and rendering and rendering and rendering and rendering, right? This component, and the same for this, right? And then I need to set some sort of quota here. I can say is, hey, this is the mean length, right? The mean length must be is equal to 5. And if I want to now define some of the, I can say pattern, right? I do think this is pattern. Let me actually is take a look at the living standard here. All right. And here, the input elements. That's right. There you go. The living standard here is this. On the max and min length, and follow using is the pattern attributes here, right? So not only that I can recreate is the pattern, all right, but I want to now is here on this pattern can say is max. Yeah, but here on the pattern, okay. Yep, yep, completely good. Here on the pattern, I want to show is this input here. Mm-mm-mm. 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 Mm. Mm-mm-mm. Where did I leave that? Mm-mm-mm. Mm-mm-mm. Holy moly. I think it's on data bind. No, it's exercise. But it's this one, two-factor authentication, and there was another one which is this. Um, yeah, but on min and max. Um, hmm. Mm, 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 mm. Mm, 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 mm. Mm, 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 mm. Hmm. Oh my god. Controlling the. Mm, 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 mm. Holy moly. Hmm. So what am I wanna do here? Pretty simple. I do want is to just use the HTML form validation. That's all. And since I use now a particular pattern to do that, right? On form data binding, what about here on forms? Data binding here. Um, hmm. Hmm. So in any case, but I do want to use this now. Yeah. So now that I'm here, let me go and take a look at the spec here, right? You say multiple requiring read-only size and the pattern attributes. So I just want to highlight here is that, right? The pattern attribute specify a regular expression against which the controls value or when the multiple attribute apply here. So here's an example. We say the pattern and the name part and the title. This is exactly what I was looking for. So for example, here in the min and max, right? Especially if you use now the man, let's say on the max length and min length, right? Since this is now a the indicating the length of this. So hey, the mean length here must be is 5. So if you put it here, you try to submit, you put at least 5 character, right? If you put here, you say, hey, please fill this out with a made like HTML, but here is using that. If for some reason you find yourself in the need to specify is another patterns, all right? To say, hey, I just want to, give me, I'll be right back. And all right. So, so that's the whole point of this, right? That's the whole idea of, so exploring is at the living standard of, I definitely going to look at this. Exploring at the living standard of the inputs, right? And as you can see, different, okay, the HTML living standard, the common infrastructure, and you can see all of this, the DOM, the scripting, the plugins, yada, 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 the terminology, fetching resources, DOMs, URLs, safe passing and structured data, serializables objects, the elements, the semantics, content model, kind of content, even select, op group options, global attributes, the elements of HTML. Okay. Document metadata, head title, base link, the meta, the styles, the sections, body article, sections, nav, assign H1 to H6, H group, headers, footers, address. Holy hell, address? Grouping content by paragraph, heading, spread, block quotes, menu, li, dt, dd, figure, main, search. And it's interesting because it also provides some of the, that's interesting. Okay, it also provides some examples here of when you can use this, for example, right? Content model, flow content, and the figures as well. So the idea of this, right, is to explore now the living standard, the HTML living standards. I won't dive into each one of those because, of course, I don't have time to do so. But to make sense of how can we do that and what are the things that we might need to go with and so on and so forth, right? That is interesting. So here we can actually have a sense of what are the things that we can now get and retrieve, okay? And what are the things that we can do as well, right? The different network states as well, right? And that's interesting because it comes from empty, idle, loading, and no source. Again, this is a non-normative, right? A media element. the resource selection algorithms for that, right? So it'll empty. Again, this is the kind of thing that we're gonna explore in this half an hour here. But this is it. This is it. You just, anytime that you are in doubt, you just look at the HTML spec. You ask a couple questions. Here, as you can see, this is the tabular data. How you can work with the tabular data. Similar for the forms. And here, which is exactly what I'm exploring in today's video, the form, the label, the inputs, right? How you can actually create that. What are the different type of input that we have, or the most common one, all right, that we use, or even the type search is another one, right? In the search state, right? So, but the whole idea is that this is just to get a sense of how the things actually works behind the scenes, right? The same for the scripting, scripting template, slots, canvas, right? How you can now draw elements in the canvas, and so on and so forth. Microdata, hidden, user interactions here. So we get the idea, right? So we get also the idea of this. Okay, good. That's a lot. That's a lot here. And it's describing is now web application here, the scripting, the introduction, the agent clusters, realms and their counterparts. It's actually describing is that, right? This living standard, the scripting processing models, model specified resolutions, JavaScript specification hosts, the event loops, the events, and so on and so forth, the timers, the micro task queue, right? Who process that? And the micro task queue, user prompts, and system state and capabilities, and the communications, and the web workers, and the worklet, web storage, HTML syntax, right? In any case, the rendering phase also here, right? That's interesting. So, but in any case, this is the entire HTML living standard. I just looking here at the input, all right, and how you can use, for example, is the pattern property here to pass now a regular expression to say, hey, anytime that you add something or to add a more straightforward implementations of an input or a text area. Hey, I do want to be this as a string or just only numbers, or a given length to that. So now when you're trying to submit that, it will help. So it's up to the HTML to prevent that default behaviors. So what I mentioned here is that this is how you can now, for example, is trying to provide is, so to combine is everything that I have looked so far with the form, how you can combine that with the data fetching, particularly here on events, okay? And in the React, how we use this as a way to send some piece of information, right? So far, so good. And also combining is all of the prerequisites for data fetching, which is a little bit of history of the history of sending data from the client to web server via forms, and then now the XML HTTP requests, and then ultimately at the fetch. And on each one of them, so what is the trade-off of using each one of those? And well, so what is the requirements here for knowing how to send data in React context? So further you need to know, of course, is, well, the synchronous and asynchronous. What is the difference between that, and how important is for you to understand now JavaScript per se? That is, hey, how this language actually describes synchronous statements and asynchronous statement, and how the things work, right? And just for history purpose, again, something that I mentioned before is the form, or you can traditionally send data using form, and then we have the XML HTTP requests as a way to send now information programmatically. And because that is quite messy to read, why we have now is the Fetch API, and to combine with all of these different features that live in the ECMAScript script. So, and also we need to know is what is the what is the promise? What is an HTTP methods? And this is also why they ask this kind of questions, a lot of them. That's why they ask this ton of questions to actually see if the developers know what it's doing. You know what I mean? Hey, do you know what you're doing, or you just memorize all of this? Do you know the trade-off of the things? Also, we need to know is the Fetch API as well. So here, just looking at how can we now fetching on events, all right? And so for example, here's another one. And how useful is for us to use this idle loading and success error as it is. So one interesting thing is that this actually comes from the different network state. This is not something that is come up out of the wild here. It actually comes from the living standard here. If you look at, if you look at the living standard here, especially at the table of content, and we explore here about how do we communicate, is communication no, how do we send data? All right, let me see if I can find this. Rendering obsolete, loading web page. I will say that this is web applications. No. Loading web pages. Location, history, API, event interface, navigation. But now I am more interested into user interactions here. Is this one? I'm just trying to understand how the people who wrote this actually makes sense for them. To describe is the data fetching, HTML syntax, reordering, HTML syntax, rendering, obsolete features. It'll be on this. This is the common infrastructure for the web. Fetching resources and terminology might be here. No, it's not. Common DOM interface. Jesus. Again, they have their own particular way to define this. I didn't set this. Semantics, documents, fetching data, network states. Okay, where is this? What is this, by the way? It say this is for the element. Okay, the elements of HTML. Okay, so here we have is the HTML elements, the document metadata, the different sections that we can have, the grouping content of the HTML, the top level semantics of that, the links, right? And exactly all the different type of links, right? The edits, the embedded content, picture, source, image, video, iFriend, embed, something that we don't use that any longer. This is something that we shouldn't use, by the way. Embedded, video, audio, track, media elements, tabular data, forms, right? Okay, in media elements and the different network states here, right? This is where it actually gets these things. Whether it's empty, has not yet been initialized, whether it's idle, loading or no source. It's active, but it has yet not found the resource to use. So in other words, this is an error. But this is where the things actually are coming from. And this is part of the media elements here on the network state and the ready state. For web developers, this is a non-normative here. So in any case, this is it, right? This is why it's useful when dealing with networking or data fetching, why having these 4 different states are useful for us, right? And how we can actually use the status to show or hiding whenever it fits, right? You can show it's only this, or we can now is rendering is this when something is a success, or when something goes wrong, you know, as it is. So this is fetch on events. And when it comes to fetching on mount, here's a new set of problems that happens. This is a particular scenarios. So the relevant problems here are just that how do we now catch their data? How do I catch the response of the data? Okay, across multiple components. And the other is that how do I make sure that that data doesn't grow stale and revalidate here? This is why we have, for example, is this kind of or libraries here, whether it's React Query or SWR, stale while revalidate, that covers this specific case, right? And let's see how it works. Intro to SWR. Here's an MVP implementation, and feel free to poke of this. So what happened is that with the SWR, or with this set of problems when fetching data when the component is mounted, the SWR says this is the kind of things that we need to handle when certain things happen or when an X amount of time has passed. First, when somebody else now changed tab and then go back, I want to revalidate this. And when an X amount of time has passed, I want to revalidate this data.
So I recognize.
And especially here, right? So here we are just passing is this. So this useRWR, right, is saying, hey, let's go into now is inject this function. So the fetching part, the data fetching part is something that is agnostic for this library. So you are the responsible to pass that data to this hook. And it is up to the hook to handle these different use cases. So what happened when the component is mounted and now it's in a different tabs and then go back to the tab? So I want to now revalidate that, or when the next amount of time has passed, or if there are any errors in there, or if there are any data that I get from, right? And what you want to do with that, you know. So if the data actually exists, now I would like to make sure that it shows that properly. Which is in this case, it use now this JSON, okay, as it is for that. So this is part of the exercise here. And I already did this, okay? Because anytime that you encounter this data fetching problems, this is the 4 states that you want to do, right? You want to handle. Here you want to handle is the idle, the idle, the loading, or the pending, the success, and the error state, right? So idle is something that is going to show at the beginning of this, right? And as you can see, I'm actually is now showing is different results based on the data that is available or not, right? So I want to get rid of this, right? And as you can see here, look at this. So what I'm doing here is just not only by defining is that data and updating that particular piece of states to actually show that properly, the form, but I want to now show is that state based on a particular, or when certain things happen here. So for example, I can say, hey, this is the first time, and if I do something here, it's a search result and searching, and the next time I can say, hey, B, and it's showing me is now searching right below. So that might something that I want to show in my because I have all of this. So now if that show on at the end, right? So what I can do is to say something like this. So let me show this first and then the idle here. So when I refresh this and I show this on the first time, this is the initial state, right? And then on the subsequent time, I can say, hey, let me look at for the searching and search result. So this is something that you might not want to show this as it is. All right. This might be something that you don't want to show like that. So you might want to show something like this inside of that, right? Okay. You might want to show something like this here. You know, in that order, actually that looks way much more intuitive, right? That actually looks much more properly. But the thing here is that this is the piece of information that I want to show only as long as that exists. All right. So here I want you to show is this when this is idle. So when this is idle, I want you to show is this, which is the first time. If it's not, should now show this as it is. All right. And then on the network status here, which say, hey, I'm gonna show this specific tag when it is loaded. All right. And then down below the search result, as you can see here, right?
So I hope you'll bear with me. I'm getting over COVID at the moment, and I feel great, but my voice is a little bit rough. So hopefully that isn't too distracting. Let's do some network requests. I'm going to start this exercise by writing a function handle search. It's going to receive an event, and it's going to stop the default behavior of whatever this event is. This makes sense because I'm going to pass this function to the forms on submit handler. And, you know, by default, when I submit a form, it's going to request a brand new HTML document from the backend. That isn't really what I want in this case. I want to request the results themselves. Although, the way I've set it up right now, by stopping that default behavior, I've actually just broken everything. Like, this form no longer does anything at all. So let's do something about that. Now, I know that I'm going to want to make a request using fetch to the endpoint, but it's not quite that straightforward, because this endpoint, as it stands, we want to make a GET request, but we also want to include the user's search term. And we want to do that with a query parameter like search term equals orbit. And so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a new URL variable, which is going to be a template string that includes the endpoint, and then adds search term equals, and then interpolate in the search term. Fortunately for us in this exercise, we've been given a search term state variable, and it's already wired up to this text input controlling it. So that part is done for us. Now, I also want to use async await, so I'm going to make this an async function so that I can await the result of this fetch, passing the URL in, and capturing the response in a variable. That should be enough for us to test and see if this works. So if I pop over to the network tab and submit this search, I see a request right away. It's in progress. The payload we see, we did indeed send the query string of search term orbit equals search term equals orbit, and that's because I forgot to remove it from the URL. So always good to test things like this. If I do this again, click search, we see our request. The payload now looks a lot better. Search term is equal to orbit. And when the request resolves under preview, I can see that I get OK true, and I get an array of results. In order to use those results, well, first we have to get the raw JSON, so we'll await response.json. And then I'm going to call set search results passing json.results. That should, in theory, give us a brand new set of results that we can render in this area. And right now down there we have sort of this template, right, an example of what we want to render. So I'm going to get rid of that. Right now it exists only in the clipboard as I add search results.map, getting each individual result and then pasting that template so that I can still include one search result per result, passing in that result under the result prop. Now when I do this, I get an error, cannot read properties of null. And the reason for this is that when the page first loads, before I've submitted the form, search results is indeed null, and I can't map over null. So what I'm going to do, just to silence this error for now, is I'm going to add a little question mark over here. This is known as the optional chaining operator, and essentially what it does is if this value is null or undefined, it doesn't even try to attempt the functions or properties or whatever's being chained afterwards. Instead, the whole thing resolves to undefined. And so now, if I enter a search term like orbit, hey, check it out. We get our 2 books that have the word orbit in the title. This is working fabulously. If I enter a single letter, we get a much larger list of book results. Incidentally, these books are not totally random. They are the best books, my favorite books in the sci-fi fantasy genres that I could think of off the top of my head. So if you like this genre, and if you recognize a couple of these books, you might enjoy some of the others. Now with this done, we've effectively completed the MVP of our search, but there's still a lot to be desired about this user experience. I want to show an initial state, I want to show a loading state, an error state, and a no results state.
Exactly.
So let's add a state variable called status, and it's going to start life as idle. And like we saw a little bit earlier, the options are going to be idle, loading, success, and error. And when we first submit the search, I'm going to set the status to be loading.
Call that network state.
When the JSON has been successfully parsed, we can check and see if it was successful or not. I'm going to see if JSON.OK. If that property is truthy, we will consider that a success, so we'll set the results, and we'll also set the status to success. Otherwise, we will set the status to error. And if we look at what we're rendering, really, this entire chunk of markup should really only be shown in the success case, because we don't want to show the results unless we have successfully completed the search. This allows us to add other branches for other statuses. So if the status is idle, which is how things are at first, we're going to add a paragraph, which is going to say, welcome to book search.
Exactly.
If the status is loading, we will also render a paragraph, but the text will say searching. If the status is error, once again, another paragraph, but the text will be something went wrong. Now, all of these are sort of placeholders, right? Like, if you go to Amazon.com, you don't see welcome to book search, you see a bunch of categories and products and ideas. And so really, because we're focusing on the logic, each of these should be thought of as placeholders, where really this would be its own component with a bunch of internal complexity and UI and fireworks and whatever else we felt like putting in there. We can test this out. If I search for orbit, we see, hey, searching text briefly shown until the results are available. I also just realized now, it's such an easy mistake to make. I forgot to apply a key. And of course, we would see that if I looked at the console. Always a good reminder to look at that more often. In terms of what we should use for the key, well, we do have, if I, let's open the network request. If we look at the results, I have this ISBN, right? This is sort of a unique identifier in the publishing world. And because ISBNs are themselves meant to uniquely identify a given book, that is a perfect bit of data we can use as the key. So I will set the key equal to result.isbn. So we've seen the initial idle state, we've seen the loading state, we've seen the success state. Let's test the error state. And we can do that with our query parameter simulated error equals true. So now when I enter a search term and click go, we see our something went wrong message. And so we have our 4 states. They all seem to be working pretty well. So we're done, right? Well, what about this, right? What about the empty state? What if we search for something that doesn't have any results, which is very easy to do since the whole database is only about 20 books? What should we do in this case? Well, we want to show a paragraph that says no results found. And it's sort of like its own status. And so maybe we could, let's add another status like empty. That could probably work. When we get the results, maybe I'll check and see json.results.length. If it's greater than 0, then we'll use success. Otherwise, I'll use empty. Coming down here into the results, I can add a 5th branch for empty, and the text can be no results. Trying this out now, I search, and we do indeed see no results. Now this is a perfectly valid solution, and I do like that it keeps things like we have these 5 branches.
Yeah.
One of these 5 cases is always true. But the one thing that's a little bit weird about this to me is that empty is really like a variation of success. Like everything went well, right? They didn't hit an error. They're not loading. We did successfully receive the response, and it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's just that there aren't any results. And so I want to explore another way of doing this. I'm going to get rid of my empty state. That is not going to be a thing. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a variant within here. And this is going to look really janky for a second. I promise we will address it, but I want to show it the way that I think a lot of developers will instinctively do it, and then we'll see a better way to do it. Within this branch of these possible outcomes, we can add a ternary expression, where we say something like search results.length greater than 0. If that's the case, then I will show the results. Otherwise, I will show a paragraph with no results. And this works exactly as you would expect, exactly as we saw before, where when there are results, we see those results, and if there aren't any results, we see the no results paragraph. But whenever I see this, right, whenever I see something like we have nested logic like this, it always just hurts my brain. It's so much harder to figure out what is going on when we have nested logic like this. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a new component called search result list. It's going to receive search results as a prop, and it's going to return our search results. So I'm going to copy this chunk of markup from up here to here. But it's also going to have an early return. And so if in this component search results.length is equal to 0, if we don't have any results, in other words, well, then I'm going to render this paragraph. And now the success branch of this, I'm going to get rid of all this complicated logic and render a search results list element passing search results as a prop. And so once again, it works exactly the same way. We either see the no results paragraph or we see the list of results, but it's a different way of structuring the code. And what I like about this approach is now we have our standard 4 different statuses, right? These are sort of the global 4 that I always find myself using. And in the success variant, we have a component, and now whether or not to show this paragraph is sort of like a separate concern. It's part of the search results list, right? If the list is empty, we want to show this paragraph. Otherwise, we want to show the results themselves. Now, in terms of which of these ideas is better, like having an empty status versus nesting it within a component like this, they're both perfectly valid, right? I think there are different strategies and are equally okay. It's just about what trade-offs you prefer. But I do think if you go the route of having the empty condition as part of the success status, it really, really helps to pluck out a component like this. And in fact, we're doing this all in one big file because it's just easier in the context of these exercises. But in a real application, this would definitely be in its own file, our search result list component. And I would also take this form and put it into its own component as well in its own file, essentially trying to break apart this complexity and manage it, right? Compartmentalize it so that different pieces live in different places, and we can build up an application out of small, relatively straightforward pieces.
So the TLDR of this is to say, hey, this is good because not only that I define is the specific logic for that, right? I also want to here is say, hey, I want to show is this when this is. So I do want to show is this. Let me actually pull it here. Right. So I do want to show is this when this is ill. I do want to show this when this is loading, and I do want to show now here. So this is idle. This is, I will also love to show is the error message as well. So they want to show is this as it is. Say, hey, the network status is now error. All right. And say, hey, something went wrong. Something went wrong. Right. This is on idle, and this is on run, and this is on loading. Right. Can you just put it that way? All right. I just want to see if this is something that can. There you got it. So whether it's idle or error or loading, and if this is now success, right? This network on success, right? Success. Instead of actually now wrapping this into its own particularity. So instead of this is interesting because look at this. So anytime that you want to show specific different states that they are not overlapping, okay, which are exclusive, mutually exclusive events that happens. In this case, this is why, oh my God, graph type theory and group theory is something that is quite useful here. So anytime that I do want to now is wrap or to define is a specific states mutually exclusive, so I can now is for readability say this. This is a pattern. This is a pattern that I really love about this. So instead of actually defining its own logic here and say, hey, this is the search result, but this search result is also going to check if this, you know, and say, hey, instead of saying this search result and length is greater than 0, so if this is the case, right? So I do want it to show is this, which is a paragraph, and say what the French does. Okay. And say no result. All right. And otherwise you just show this. So instead of saying this, which is something that is quite hard to read, right? And again, this will work as intended. So if we go searching here, it's supposed to show is this search result as it is. Say, hey, oh, sorry, this is here, right? So here we're showing is no results. I do want to show, in fact, is using now an H2 just for this exercise, right? And say something like this, right? So no result. If I go today, searching, and it's supposed to show is those results, right? And if this is success, and if the search length is equal to 0, so show this, right? Or you can say is less or equal than 0, so show this, right? If it's not, then I would like you to, I don't know what's wrong with this, searching, and they're supposed to search this. That's interesting. And it say, hey, this is the network. If the network is success, all right. But if the length is equal to 0, I want to show you this, all right. So in other words, we'll have is just to say, hey, I need you to evaluate is this conditions, right? Right, and if that is okay, show you this, and if it's not, show you this. So because this can become quite messy, right? So because this logic here can become quite messy, and especially for data fetching applications, this particular pattern is something that is useful to define each individual event and what is going to be rendered here. So instead of doing us this, right, we just can now abstract this into its own component. Say, hey, this will be now, what is the name of this? Search results. You can say, what does he call him? He called that as...
These are ideas we will continue to explore in this course, specialize it so that different pieces in a real application as part of the
search result list. No, right? It called search result list, where I'm going to receive is now the results as plural, right? And here I do want is to now is do this. Hey, do this early statement, hey, if this is the search result is equal to 0, right? Then I want you to return is this no result as it is, right? However, if it's not, right? However, uh, if it's not, right, then I want you to return is this mapping operations here, right? That is going to wrap this as well as this, right? So this is what I want you to show here, and they call here search result. I'm just gonna rename this to the result, and that'll be all. Exactly. Is this one. And there you go. And here on the network status, what we're gonna say is that, hey, I just want us to render this component, all right? And let me now is pass is the data as a result, right? And here I'm called this is search result. So what I'm doing here is just to say, hey, I'm defining is these specific possible states that are mutually exclusive from each other, and this improves the readability in my code. And if you find yourself in the need to handle some sort of logic in there, you abstract that into their own components here. So here, if you find for this, you're gonna have is this. Say, hey, what French toast? Oh, I can. Oh, I can do is this. That's right. Yep, you're right. Search result list is not defined. Search result list. Search result list. I'm gonna pass is the results here. Reload this. Oh, it's because is here. You're right. There you go. Okay, and this is now how lovely is this thing is working. Say no results. And if you find yourself in the need to pass some errors here, you can pass this now the query params to do that as expected. But this elegant solution here is just to see what are different possible state that this component can show, especially for searching, right? Here. And again, to improve the code readability and fetching the current user here. So what it is we are now using is the useRWC which is a custom hook that the first parameter is going to receive is the endpoint, and the second parameter is at this fetcher function that describe what you want to do with it. And here is going to give you now is a data and an error if there is, among other features here, right? But this must be used is inside of the component, right? So now when this component is mounted, all right, if I define is the fetcher function here, and I'm going to pass now is the endpoint, right? And then I am responsible for handling is the data fetching. All right, so I'm gonna have is the endpoint here. The question is that why do we want to do this endpoint expect a get request to simulate an error, do is this. So because this expect and I get, I can just leave it as it is, wait, right, and get that response as it is. So once I already have the response, I do want to transform that into a human readable or into a JSON object. So now I can have the data here, and then I can return now is the data. The thing here is that I don't know what is the shape of the data. All right, so I need to apply the async function. All right, and here since I don't know what is the shape of this data, I can now is console log the data here. It seems that I don't have any data at that moment, which is quite interesting. I'm assuming a lot of things, by the way, of that data, right? And once that is done, I have this user. All right, so that's the shape of the data. In this case, let me call here now user. So if the data that is true, so I can now send is the data, otherwise return undefined, right? So there is no response as it is, right? So if that is the case, right? So if that is the case, we're either going to have is that object or undefined. So if for some reason we are receiving is this piece of data here, and I'm going to return is the data dot user, okay. It seems that we need to always return is data. Otherwise, return is the data as expected. So whether if the data is is data.user or data, here you are changing the shape of this data as it is, right? So here now is the user initially, right? So once the component is mounted, initially is undefined, right? So it seems that I need to rename that as data, not as a user, because that's how now this hook is exposing to me. And I can show you now is that piece of data as it is. I can say, hey, data dot name, right? And the other is data dot email here, only like that. So this is just to solve is the pretty use case, the common use case. If the request failed, you can show an error message, and a standard paragraph with something went wrong is fine. So here I can do is now this and say an if early return, say, hey, if there is an error here, I want to now is return is this and say, hey, please let's go to return is this paragraph and say, hey, something went wrong. I can simulate that with this parameter here, query parameter, right? And it say I cannot read property name for that. So you are the M, right? So if error exists, I want you to run this. If it's not, please go and throw this. Because it's trying to read this. Simulated error true doesn't give me that.
So the first thing I'm going to do in this one is create a brand new async function, and we have undefined for the error and an object with an OK property set to true, and email will be set to data.user.email. Now this looks pretty good. I do see that I'm getting happening is that initially for that very first render, data is undefined and error is undefined. These variables are only populated once this code has had a chance to finish running. It actually reminds me quite a bit of refs, where refs are also undefined until after the first render. For now, I'm going to solve this by using the optional chaining operator. So if we don't have data, well then we just won't do any of this, and instead we'll wind up with a blank screen at first. I guess actually that's a good indication that it's time to add some sort of loading state. And so I'm going to say is loading is equal to not data and not error, right? If either of these exist, if either we've returned some JSON that we want to use as the data, or we've hit some sort of snag, we've thrown something, and the error value has been populated. If either of those things are true, we're not loading anymore. But until that is the case, we will be in our loading state. And for loading, I'm going to return a spinner. If I refresh the page, we should see a brief moment of spinner before things load. The last thing to tackle is the error state, and this one in particular can be sort of counterintuitive. First things first, I need the backend to provide an error, and so I'm going to add the simulated error query parameter. When I do that, if I look at my logs and I'm still logging data and error, error is still undefined, and now data is this object describing the error. The reason I say that this is counterintuitive is that I know by adding this simulated error flag that the server is providing a 500 status code, right? The universal signal for something has exploded on the server. And we might expect that to automatically be picked up so that as I run this code, it would populate the error variable instead of the data variable. The trouble is that SWR has no idea what happens inside this function, right? It calls the function, and if I return something, it's going to use whatever that returned value is as the data. To populate the error, I have to throw something instead of returning something. So here's what I'm going to do. If JSON is not okay, right? If JSON.ok does not exist, because it doesn't exist in this object, but it does exist in the happy path response, then I'm going to throw JSON. And so if I refresh this page now, what I notice is that data is undefined, and error is now this object with the error property. It's a good reminder that SWR does not actually manage the network request stuff. It manages everything around that, but we're still the ones making the request and deciding what counts as a success and what counts as a failure. Now that we have the correct values being populated over here, we can add our error state. I'll add an if error check, and if that's true, I'll return a paragraph that says something went wrong. With that done, I see that we transition from our loading state to our error state. That one was really quick, but I did see it for a second. And if I remove this query parameter, we should see transitioning from loading to the happy state. And indeed, we do. Stick a fork in this solution, it's done.
Stick a fork in this solution. SWR didn't yet provide an is loading value, and this is relatively new feature as part of the 2.0 release. I have updated the code solution to use the built-in is loading value. Sorry for any confusion. But again, the same. All of these custom hooks when dealing with transferring data. So there are these 4 possible cases, and building that for your own actually make you to understand what these things is doing. And that is defining as a state internally that for each one of those common cases, whether it is idle, success, error, and loading, you're going to show now different markdown, right? In the case of these custom hooks, now they behave quite somewhat similar, but when you are reading something of the, in this case for this API, you need to throw something. You need to throw an error to notify, hey, something went wrong with this. As now it's being captured by this custom hook, which is a function that say, hey, something went wrong, and now it's gonna give you is this error state. But as you can see here, it's the same logic as it is, right? It's showing you the loading, the error, as well as this particular state here. An async effect gotcha here. Suppose we want to fetch some data on mount, and we don't want to use SWR. We'll make a fetch request inside of the use hook. Exactly. So now if you don't want to run that, if you don't want to use the SWR, you want to fetch requests inside of an effect. And here's a gotcha here. So most developers will try to develop something like this. But unfortunately, this doesn't work the way it is, right? Effects callbacks are synchronous. To prevent race condition, put the async code inside of the use effect. This is something that I'm not quite familiar with, and I don't quite understand here. When you talk about race conditions, effects callbacks are synchronous to prevent race conditions. Makes a ton of sense. Okay, effects callbacks are synchronous to prevent race to prevent race conditions. So now React behind the scene is scheduling this task in order. So not only in order, but to and avoid any asynchronous code. All right. Okay. So React say, hey, all of these scripts is going to be scheduled in order, synchronously, to prevent any race conditions. Okay, makes a lot of sense. So what this is doing is that internally, if you want to now trigger all of these different script, and if you allow to handle a synchronous script, some script might take longer than others, and that creates now some these race conditions where the order of all of these scripts, if you want to maintain that order of execution in these asynchronous environments, this can create is a management chaos, something that React's teams say, hey, no, we're not going to deal with this. right? So only passes is synchronous callback. If you find yourself in the need to run those asynchronous callback, we are not going to handle that. It is up to the JavaScript engine to do that. To prevent race conditions amounts effects. Remember, all of these effects are now scheduled after the render happens, and they're gonna kick off, and they're gonna kick off. Yeah, so they're gonna kick off after the renders happens. Okay, makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. In addition to the cryptic error message, we also see the following warning in the console. useEffect must not return anything besides a function. Which is used for cleanup. If it looks like you wrote your useEffect async or returns a promise, instead write a sync function inside of your effect and call it immediately. Exactly. So this is an async effect gotcha for data fetching. and a very common thing that you're gonna do. Let's say I'm gonna call this let's say I'm gonna call this here async function here, and this is what get temperature. Get temperature. Yep. So get temperature. There you got it. Get temperature, and then right after that I do 1 is 2. There you get it. And then I'll call this immediately after that, get temperature, right? So now when this component is loaded and it's a hey JSON.temperature, right? Set temperature. We're not passing any state, we're just only invoking this function here. This is it, right? Or you can be now say fetch temperature, right? And then do something like this. So fetch temperature, and remember that you always must return is now a cleanup function here. So in our case, we're not returning is nothing here, right? So if we reload this, we get this as it is. This is interesting. Initially, wait, what? Initially was like 27, and then minus 16. That's interesting. That changed twice. Oh, it's because we are on development mode and strict mode. What's happening is here is that now this is being called. So when this component is mounted, it's called the effects, then the cleanup, and then the effects. That's what it's doing here. And the wrong effects here. I like to use a generic name like wrong effect instead of a specific name like fetch temperature to make it clear that we're moving everything related to the effect into this function. Oh, okay, you say run effect. To say, hey, that's interesting. For a synchronous operation. If you reload this, first is load this, the cleanup function, and then runs the effect again. In our effect, has a cleanup function. The cleanup function should not be included in our run effect. To be clear, we don't run this into the issue at all when using data fetching library like SWR. This is one of the many problems that those tools solve for us. But I want to cover this anyway because not everyone uses data fetching libraries. And even if you do, there still may be cases where you want to await some sort of asynchronous operations unrelated to data fetching. Why async effects callbacks aren't allowed. That's a long run, by the way. That's a long run. It might seem silly to create and immediately invoke an async function. Why aren't allowed to pass an async function directly to the user effect? The first thing to understand about async function is that they are always return a promise. Is that they always return a promise. So this quick example function doesn't actually return the number 5. It returns a promise that resolves to 5. Effect logic start at interval. This is true for all async functions, even ones that don't await anything. This is important because React expects us to return a cleanup function and not a promise. And consider an effect like this. Now, it's because, and if you think about this, not only that it expects to return is a function, but to prevent any race conditions, aka this script going to run, several scripts are running at the same, right after the another, right? And if for some reason one runs, here's the thing. Here's the thing. You might have is sometimes, so you might have is different tests, or for real life examples, you might have is different runners, okay? In each one of them, you know that they're starting from the same place, right? Some of them starting at different position, right? Why you make that? Because hey, you want to actually know which one of them trigger first, which one of them run first, right? And do their thing, because those different runner or those different tasks might take less amount of time than others. So then you have now a coordination problem. Reacting has a coordination problem. So they decide to say, no. Always return me is now a cleanup function first. And if you find yourself in the need to run any async operations right after the render happens, let delegate that to the JavaScript engine here, or to whoever is handling these async operations. Particularly is the async, Jesus, particularly the holy hell, the event loop. All right, whether it's you're using is timers or a promise. For example, when React runs our effect, we handed a cleanup function, and React will invoke this cleanup function when the dependency change and when the components are mounted. Now let's suppose we have some async work to do in this effect. For example, like this. Even though we're running a function, it is actually returning a promise that resolves to a function. Like this. When React runs this effect, it doesn't receive a cleanup function. It receives a promise. So what happens if the components are mounted while that long running process is running? React can't do any cleanup because we haven't yet handed React the cleanup function. To avoid sticky situations like this, the React team decided that effect callbacks can be a synchronous function. It will open too many cans of worms. Instead, we can wrap our async logic up into an async function, and that way React receives the cleanup functions immediately. That'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye-bye.